All right, our final speaker I have introduced to you earlier today, senior editor of the American Conservative, ladies and gentlemen, Dan McCarthy. Back in 1996, the Republican nominee for president in that year's election was Senator Robert Dole, who comes from the neighboring state of Archer Daniels Midland. Senator Dole said something very politically incorrect during the campaign against Bill Clinton. And since Dole was kind of mostly a moderate Republican, one of his actual fellow congressmen had called him the tax collector of the welfare state. Dole actually said something that was kind of controversial, which was shocking because no one expected that of someone like Bob Dole. He was criticizing President Clinton, and he was talking about why you didn't want to have Clinton reelected, why Bob Dole, would be a better president. He referred to, quote, democratic wars. And the press just went berserk. The idea that Bob Dole would introduce this partisan element in criticizing America's past foreign policy. Now, Bob Dole was someone who'd actually served in World War II. He had lost the use of his right arm, I believe, in that conflict. He wasn't someone who, had no experience, but he was aware. He was old enough to remember that the idea that the Republican Party and that conservatives are the party of war and the party of conflict is historically false. In fact, conservatives, up until the sort of late 1980s and the first Bush administration, tended to be the side of politics that was much more critical of foreign intervention and much more critical of war. Now, this is almost completely forgotten now because it's something that neoconservatives and various others have worked very hard to erase from the record. In fact, back in 2003 actually, right as we were about to go to, as Bush was about to take us to war with Iraq, National Review, which considers itself the magazine of record for the conservative movement. It hasn't been that for a very long time, actually, but it still has that sense of self-importance. It published a cover story by a fellow named David Frum called Unpatriotic Conservatives. And basically, this cover story came out a few days before the start of the Iraq War, and it condemned every single conservative except one, and I'll talk about that in a second, but every single conservative who dared criticize or dissent from the idea that we needed to go to war with Iraq and with Saddam Hussein. It said all of them were unpatriotic and un-American for having that view. The one exception, the one conservative that David Frum allowed could be, patriotic even though she opposed the Iraq War, was one who had never actually published anything about her view. It was just a privately held view that she didn't really dare share with many friends. So in fact, as far as the establishment was concerned, the only conservative dissent that was allowed on questions of foreign policy, on questions of whether or not we should send American troops to die for the sake of Iraqi freedom as opposed to our own freedom, the only dissent that was allowed was absolutely silent personal dissent. Nothing that saw print, nothing on radio, none of that would be allowed. So all of these people would be thrown out of the movement, declared unpatriotic and un-American. Well, the whole thing is a historical fraud, as I say, because in fact, conservatives have long been highly critical of foreign interventions and America's wars. And you can see why that would be. It's because, as several speakers have said, war is indeed the health of the state. When there is a war, necessarily there must be sacrifices made, and there are sacrifices that are taken out of the private economy and out of individuals' private lives. During wartime, taxes have almost always gone up. It's kind of unusual, actually, that in the past two wars we've seen taxes actually fall, although, of course, the spending continues even without a tax increase. So ultimately, that is debt spending that's going to have to be repaid with interest. So in other words, wars always make governments much more insolvent than they already are, and they're already plenty bad enough. Wars disrupt the relationship within civil society. Let me give an example. Conservatives, especially social conservatives, have been very critical of the fact that our economic system has changed so dramatically that it's not simply the case that women have the choice now to work, whereas it was rather socially unacceptable before. It's now that women are forced to work, that basically two parents have to be working, which means that children have to be turned over to government schools for longer and longer periods for after-school programs, as well as for their day schooling. That you have to have, now a lot of liberals are pushing for government-sponsored child care for children who are too young to go to school yet. All of this is because not only do women have the choice to work, which is good, but that they are forced to do so because of economic constraints. Well, the reason that you had this transformation of the American workforce, and the reason that you had women brought into the workforce in such massive numbers was directly because of World War II. That's where it starts to take off. Because as American men were conscripted, taken away from their jobs and sent overseas to fight and kill, somebody had to be in charge of manufacturing back in the homeland. Somebody had to fill all the positions that had been left vacant. And of course, that task fell to women. And after the end of the war, things didn't just return to normal. This had been a change in American culture and a change in American economy that endured even after the war. And as a result, people who were able to have both their husband and the wife working had twice as much income as people who previously had only one parent or one member of a marriage working. And so it really created a competitive situation that didn't exist before, in which everyone started having to work in order to make roughly the same amount of household income in order to buy houses and so many other things. And of course, this is a bit of a tangent, but that's also the point at which the government starts having a lot of programs to try to encourage people to go into massive debt in order to buy homes. Before that, Americans tried to save enough money to eventually buy a home. After the war, because of all the disruptions that had taken place, and because of the baby boom and the growth of the American population, government was able to say, well, everyone needs a home. They need bigger and better homes, and in order to have those, they'll have to just go into debt, and we'll create, low interest rates so that they'll take out as much debt as possible, whittling away at their personal financial freedom in order that they can buy homes. Well, all of this was a dramatic transformation that was really driven in large part by World War II and the consequences that followed. I think Doug Bandow had mentioned a wonderful book by Robert Higgs, who's a senior scholar at the Independent Institute. It's a book called Crisis and Leviathan. And the thesis of this book is whenever there's a crisis, and war is one of the preeminent kinds of crises that any government gets involved in, it's an emergency, it's something that justifies new measures and new taxes and bigger government than ever had happened before. Whenever there's a crisis, government tends to expand. That much is easy enough to understand. But after the crisis, even though government tends to contract a little bit, in fact, it never contracts back to the point where it was before the crisis even began. It always contracts a little bit, but not all the way. In other words, it's a ratchet effect, where over time, successive crises build bigger and bigger and bigger government. And as I say, war is in fact the primary crisis. It's the engine that drives so much government growth and transformation of American society. And that is really why Randolph Bourne had said after World War I, or actually around the time of World War I, that war is indeed the health of the state. This is something that a lot of people have understood and that's been kind of forgotten more recently, and that there's been a very hard propaganda push to try to inculcate in Americans the idea that war is cost-free and painless. In fact, it's never cost-free. Not only are there the lives of our soldiers and the lives of civilians who are killed, but also there's a huge cost in terms of liberty. There's a huge cost in terms of our economic productivity.